Hello everyone, Dr. Stillman here, and today we are going to be talking about why breakfast really might just be the most important meal of the day. We're going to talk about tryptophan, melatonin, how your body makes melatonin, why it makes melatonin, why tryptophan is relevant, and how your simple, humble dietary choices in the morning for breakfast can really have a profound impact on your health over the long term. What am I talking about and why does it matter? We're going to start with this paper, effective tryptophan-rich breakfast and light exposure during the daytime on melatonin secretion at night. Before I get further into the paper, shout out to everyone who's a paid subscriber on my Substack. You guys get the real dope sauce information that is it's too good for me to put outside of a paywall because I'm not willing to let people pick it up and do bad things with it. Long story. If you want to know more, go subscribe to it. Make sure you're on my Telegram channel. Make sure that you're on the free Substack version so you can get an idea of what's going to be in the paid, and obviously get my uncensored thoughts, which I can't put out on social media platforms like this lovely one. But anyway, so what did they do in this study? They had a number of different environments that they hypothesized would create different levels of melatonin. For those of you who don't know, melatonin is super important. The less melatonin you have, generally speaking, the sicker you are. But it's not as simple as more melatonin good, less melatonin bad, run out and buy high doses of melatonin and just take them for the rest of your life. No. It's much more complicated than that. It's about how your environment works, and you can't just step on the gasoline and expect to get somewhere faster. If you have, say, a broken axle or a flat tire, that may actually be counterproductive. We're going to talk about how a tryptophan-rich breakfast and a high-dose light environment can really affect your melatonin cycling, as they showed in this paper. So they had 4 groups: poor or tryptophan low diet or low breakfast, dim environment. Okay. Then they had a tryptophan-rich breakfast with a dim environment, okay? And then they had a tryptophan-poor breakfast with a bright environment, and then they had a tryptophan-rich breakfast with a bright environment, right? So, 4-quadrant plot, they varied all of them: high, low, dim, bright. The difference is stark. 55 milligrams of tryptophan in the tryptophan-poor breakfast, that's very little. 476 milligrams per meal in the tryptophan-rich breakfast. This is a reasonable amount of tryptophan that you could get in a meal if you ate an adequate amount of protein. Pro tip: grains are rich in tryptophan. So if you get a high protein grain, you could use that as part of your morning meal to meet this requirement. I love grains, unlike a lot of people these days. What about the light? Okay, so the dim light environment was less than 50 lux. To give you guys a little bit of an idea of what that really means, it's dusk here in Florida. I have a relatively warm light on for illumination in this video. And sitting right here, the amount of lux coming at me is about 70. Okay, put it towards the window, and this is a lux meter. Lux is a measurement of the units of light that are hitting an optical surface. You can download this on your phone and actually use it to quantify your environment. You'll get an idea of how different your light environments are. Your pupil is ceaselessly working in order to control the amount of light coming into your retina, so you aren't, variously blinded or left blind because things are so bright that you can't see, or so dark that you can't see. So the amount of lux coming into the windows over there is about 11. So at dusk, it's very, very dim, dark. This is an office with, south-facing windows that are open. And so in the middle of the day, that number is in the hundreds. Or if I'm actually underneath the sun and the sun's truly coming into the windows, it can be in the thousands or tens of thousands. So your light environment varies dramatically during the day. One of the red flags in history for me of a patient is I work inside in a building with no windows. Their light environment during the day may be less than 50 lux all day. People call seasonal affective disorder, and they treat it with a light lamp. I think that's a silly name. I call it light deficiency syndrome, because that's really what it is. But as we're going to talk about a little bit later, light deficiency is not as simple as add light, because what does that even mean? Light exists along a spectrum. At the very far low energy end are the radio waves and microwaves, which we're not even supposed to be exposed to in nature. And at the very, very far other end, you have the ionizing radiations like gamma waves and X-rays, which don't actually penetrate the Earth's atmosphere. And in the middle, between infrared, which you can't see but you would perceive as heat, and ultraviolet light, ultraviolet type B is what your body uses to make vitamin D. Your cells actually produce UVC in order to divide that may surprise you. That's Light Shaping Light by Roland Benwick. In between those two, bookended, those bookends are in the middle is visible light, are where life really uses light in order to do a lot of work. And light is the signal to the brain and the body that it's daytime, because if you didn't know, the sun is really bright and at night it goes away on the other side of the earth and it's really dark. So that's how your body entrains its circadian rhythms primarily. It can also use the electromagnetic field of the earth, but that's a story for another day. So what they found in this study is consistent with what they had hypothesized. The brighter the environment and the more tryptophan in the breakfast, the higher the melatonin levels in that experimental group, which implies that you can boost your melatonin levels by increasing the amount of light that you're exposed to, as well as increasing your tryptophan load. Now, there's a couple of caveats to this that I don't think people really get enough education on, which is why I do these videos. Bright, what does bright mean? Okay, the main triggers for your circadian rhythms are visible light. Visible light is what will entrain those circadian rhythms, specifically frequencies within the green and blue. But that doesn't mean that other frequencies of light don't affect melatonin production. There is an abundant literature showing that infrared and red light trigger melatonin production as well. And I caution people who use bright light therapy as visible light only, because we don't live in a world where in nature we're exposed to visible light only. 42% of the photons coming to you from sunlight are infrared. We're going to talk about why that matters in a minute. So this is the initial premise of this video. You can change your melatonin levels by changing what you have for breakfast and whether or not you eat it out on your porch or whether you eat it in a closet. Pretty profound stuff. Little changes, right? Like eating dinner out on the back patio versus, in a dark dining alcove can make a big difference, particularly over the long term, because effects from this will compound over time as melatonin works on your system in order to improve your health, as the case may be. Another thing I want to point out here is that they used creatinine adjusted melatonin in urine. Why is that important? And why is it important to adjust it for creatinine? Because that's adjusting it for the patient's body habitus. It's a crude metric to adjust it for that, but it's a really robust measurement, in my opinion, that corroborates what they're saying. Now, what they're also saying is that this could promote melatonin secretion at night. The other thing about melatonin is that at night it comes out to play. In the day, it gets produced in your skin and your soft tissues and organs and things like that in response to a variety of stimuli. But at night, it gets released from the pineal gland into the bloodstream, where it runs around the body. And I say it turns on regeneration, rejuvenation programs, much like a janitor, cleaning up all the cellular debris that got generated during the day and regenerating cellular energy stores and nutrient levels. Okay, positive effect of daylight exposure on nocturnal urinary melatonin excretion in the elderly. All right. In this study, what they did is they took 192 elderly individuals who were pretty old, 70, not ancient, but old enough. They measured ambulatory daylight exposure using a wrist light meter in 2 48-hour sessions. This is a really interesting way to study this. They basically put a light meter on someone's wrist in order to see exactly how much light they got exposed to. And then they correlated that with their overnight urinary melatonin levels. This is a metabolite melatonin, but it's, academic. And what indeed did they find? Okay, they found that daylight exposure in an uncontrolled daily life setting is positively associated with increased melatonin metabolite secretion, which is a fancy way of saying the more light you get, the more melatonin you will excrete, and therefore the more melatonin was working in your body. One of the problems I have with a lot of conventional thinking is they say, oh, you increase the amount of something in the system, but that doesn't mean that it did anything. They'll do this, for example, with vitamin C, with B vitamins, things like that. And they'll say, just because you increased the level in the urine, you just gave the patient expensive urine. We see a lot of clinical benefit to doing that in a strategic way, not in a haphazard way, but in a way that's directed by some combination of actual clinical laboratory data, empirical evidence and experience and anecdotal medicine, frankly. But the point is, in this case, the amount of light that you get can increase the amount of melatonin you're excreting, and that is a good thing. This is why lack of sunlight exposure and light exposure in general during the day tends to make people sad, i.e. seasonal affective disorder. The dark side of light at night, physiology, epidemiology, and ecological consequences. Okay. So the other thing I want you to realize about melatonin and night and circadian rhythms is that at night, as I said, melatonin comes out to play, but this can be disrupted and the release of melatonin can be delayed by exposing the body to artificial light. So you may be thinking, I'm boosting my melatonin on the one hand by having my tryptophan-rich breakfast on my front porch, but you may be hamstringing your progress towards wellness by having a really bright blue saturated screen on at all hours of the night, which delays your melatonin. We call it dim light melatonin onset, to the point that then you have a reduced window for melatonin to do its magic of regenerating your body. I believe this is why we're seeing such a profound increase in so many diseases that are associated with exposure to artificial light at night. Heart disease, cancer, stroke, other cardiovascular diseases. The list goes on and on and on and on and on. Not to mention susceptibility to infectious diseases, which is, frankly, increased and worsened by a lack of healthy circadian rhythms, a lack of these healthy, really hormones and neurotransmitters that are associated with abundant light exposure. One of the things that people get wrong about this is thinking, oh, I have light deficiency, therefore what I need is light. Hold on. We need to ask a better question here. And before I get into that question, because that's really in the next paper, the other thing that people have to be disabused of is this notion that the sun is dangerous. And I like to say that if the sun causes skin cancer, then spoons make people fat. It's not that it's untrue, it's that it's not doing justice to the complexity of the problem. One of the paradoxes of modern life is that despite the fact that we're getting less and less and less and less and less sun exposure, we now get very, very little sun exposure. If you think about the fact that the average person now spends 97% of their time inside, and skin cancer rates are doubling every couple of decades, can you explain to me how the sun causes skin cancer? The reality is that reckless sun exposure with lots of sunburns and lots of skin damage is what sets you up for skin cancer. And that's compounded by your diet. Because if you eat poorly, your body is not going to be able to cope with the oxidative stress of the sun exposure, which is why I always tell people we're the only animal on planet Earth that eats a non-local, non-seasonal diet, has the intelligence to argue about what to eat, and yet has epidemics of disease that are linked to eating the wrong thing. All the other animals just eat a local seasonal diet and are doing just fine. Thank you for asking. Well, with some exceptions, most of which are our fault anyway. So where I'm going with that is this: the foods in your environment that are going to mitigate negative effects from overexposure to sun grow in those environments. Fresh fruits, vegetables, green leafy vegetables, nuts, seeds, beans, all loaded with antioxidants, which are needed to mitigate that oxidative stress from excessive light. And this is why we see in the literature that the more sun you get, the lower your risk of death. This is just one of these trials. This is the Swedish Women's Lifestyle and Health Cohort. They love doing these studies in Sweden because they're obsessed with data and they're totally OCD. God bless them. So the women who got sunburned twice or more per year during adolescence had a reduced all-cause mortality compared with women who had been sunburned once or less. This is a really important point for you all to take home. Do you care more about getting skin cancer or do you care more about dying? Personally, I'd rather have skin cancer than die. In real terms, about 12,000 Americans per year die of skin cancer. And that's being pretty generous. 12,000 is nothing compared to the total amount of Americans, the number of Americans that die each year. It's hardly even a drop in the bucket. So saying that you're going to avoid the sun because you're afraid of skin cancer is to me a little bit like saying you're going to avoid the beach because you're afraid of sharks. It's just not really fair. That's not even a fair comparison because just going to the beach doesn't reduce your all-cause mortality. The caveat to that being, I don't think anyone's actually studied that, and I'm sure that it does. So go to the beach. It's good for you. But I digress. So the women who got more sunburns had reduced all-cause mortality. And all-cause mortality is really important because it's the metric by which we should judge pretty much everything. Because why do I care about anything that doesn't actually meaningfully reduce your risk of death? The answer is that I don't. If some intervention like avoiding the sun or slathering up with sunscreen or taking an injection or whatever meaningfully reduces your risk of all-cause mortality, that's interesting and it's worth me investigating and recommending as a doctor. And if it doesn't, why do I care? Something else that they notice here, and they also confirm this, by the way, with a reduced risk for all-cause and cardiovascular mortality in women who went on sunbathing vacations more than once a year over 3 decades. They're literally telling you to go sunbathing, not in some kind of reckless way that will leave you looking like a wrinkled paper bag, but in a way that where you get adequate levels of vitamin D and other very healthy hormones and neurotransmitters that are produced in response to light, okay? Now, one of the things that they point out here is solarium use once or more per month for at least 1 decade increased the risk of all-cause mortality when compared with women who never used a solarium. In this context, solarium is artificial UV exposure. Why do we see increased mortality with artificial ultraviolet light? Virtually everywhere I look in natural medicine, the more closely you copy nature, the better the outcome you get. When you start breaking the rules, you need to be really careful because you're starting to play with fire and you've got to realize that it can be very, very hot. So what they're saying here is that when you use artificial UV light alone in order to say tan, this would be tanning beds in the United States, you're increasing your mortality. What is that UV light in that solarium missing? It's missing the visible and it's missing the infrared portions of full spectrum sunlight. I use a UVB lamp in the winter in order to get my vitamin D, but I use a very low dose relative to what you need to tan. This is the difference between the minimal erythemal dose and the minimal melanogenic dose. It's also a difference in frequency because UVB produces vitamin D at a very high rate. UVA does not. And so there's not an appreciable risk of increased skin cancer with judicious use of a UVB lamp. You can get a burn if you're careless, but you're not at significant risk if you use it for like 5 minutes a day, which is all you're going to need in order to get vitamin D pretty much anywhere in the world, depending on your skin type, depending on what illnesses you have. And this is one reason why I rep and have an affiliate account with the Spurdy vitamin D lamp. I love that thing. It is very effective. And it keeps my vitamin D levels normal through the winter. And that's why I don't need to take a UVB supplement, or rather a vitamin D supplement. Okay, on to the last paper that we're going to talk about, because this is a really important point that people miss. So I mentioned this earlier. For over 3 decades, skin cancer rates have continued to rise amongst Caucasians, despite the development and widespread usage of UV blocking sunscreen. You would think someone would do a robust, rigorous, study of whether or not sunscreen actually works, but I don't know what the dermatologists are doing instead, probably figuring out how to make more money with Botox. What the model indicates is that not only are equal amounts of free radicals generated by the ultraviolet and high energy visible photons, but that the free radicals generated by the high energy visible photons are generating large amounts of lipid-free radicals. This is a very, very, very important sentence. For those of you who did not follow that, high energy visible photons are in the blue, generally speaking, purple or green spectrums, depending on how you want to define it. These photons do produce large amounts of lipid-free radicals. You don't sense lipid-free radicals. They're beneath your notice, but they can be having a negative effect on your physiology, whether you notice them or not. What are free radicals or lipid-free radicals and lipid peroxides, which are part of or sort of subcategory of that? What are they associated with? Virtually every single disease you want to avoid. Autoimmunity, allergy, cancer, cardiovascular disease. I mean, all the big killers of Americans come down to high levels of lipid-free radicals or lipid peroxides. So you would think that people would catch on to the fact that bombarding themselves with artificial light that's rich in these photons might have a negative effect not only on skin cancers, but all kinds of other diseases. And this is why diseases of the eye are exploding in prevalence and severity, because these high energy visible photons are coming in to the eye and they are creating all of this lipid peroxidation and free radical stress. The ratio of lipid oxygen species and reactive oxygen species increases based on dose as expected. So the more light you get, the more lipid peroxidation and free radical production you get. Sunburn is a natural body response that warns us to get out of the sun by blocking the UV, but transmitting the HEV photons. The public is misled into spending more time exposed to HEV photons. Lipid-free free radicals have been linked to skin cancer and other diseases. Under natural sunlight, the near-infrared photons have been shown to provide protection from the damage induced by both UV and visible photons in vivo, and will be discussed later in the paper. And that is the point that I really wanted to make before my closing thought, which is that infrared light is the remedy and the antidote to the lipid peroxidation induced by high energy visible photons and ultraviolet light. And this is why sunlight always wins in the all-cause mortality game. And that's why anyone who tells you to slather up with sunscreen and cover up your body all of the time, you can do it selectively, because I don't want you to run out and burst into flames. Shout out to my redheads and pale freckled people. You need to be careful because you can, burn, this. The near infrared light is the antidote to all that stress and lipid peroxidation that's induced by these high energy and UV light photons. And all in all, sun exposure reduces all-cause mortality. Can I get an amen? Okay, last point. There is a general misconception that existing artificial lighting is benign with flux levels too low to generate damage. That's not true. And what I really want you to understand is that no one's demonstrated that artificial light without a balance of infrared light has no negative effect on human physiology and biology. Quite to the contrary. I believe it has a profound effect. This is why I'm a big fan of natural light. It's why I ask patients, what is your lighting environment at home? What is it in your work environment? How can we make it better? And when I'm coming up with better lighting solutions for people, my optimal lighting solutions are a combination of infrared, visible, and UV light, because I don't want to be using these frequencies in isolation without understanding the complete context of the patient. And the more they want to break the rules, the more time we got to make sure that we're not cutting any corners and not creating any long-term problems by exposing them to frequencies of light in isolation from the ones they need to balance them out, which is all a fancy way of saying, make sure that you get enough tryptophan so that you have enough melatonin to cope with all the amazing stresses of modern life that are gobbling up your melatonin so fast that many of you are on track for diseases associated with low melatonin levels, increased oxidative stress, and premature aging. So as always, make sure you're subscribed to all my other channels, Telegram, Substack, all that other social media stuff that I don't really get on anymore personally, because it's so controlled. It's so controlled and censored, and I just can't stand that. As always, thanks for watching, everyone. Take care. Have a great day. If this video has been helpful to you, make sure that you check out my link tree below to find out how you can keep in touch with me best. And if you would like to become a patient at my practice, please apply to work with me at stillmanmd.com. Thank you again for watching. Have a great day.